My name is Charles Tannock. I'm an MEP for London for the Conservatives, and this is my fourth mandate. I've done 19 years serving London in the European Parliament.
So what does Brexit mean to you personally?
Well, it's painful for me. I've given almost 20 years of my life professionally to being part of the European project. I regard Brexit as a selfish and destructive act, disentangling 45 years of building the project together. I regard it actually as a threat to Britain's role in the world in terms of its security. And after all, the European Union is one of the great peace and prosperity projects that has ever been devised by humanity, and we're in the process of trying to reverse that. And I think in a sort of increasingly dangerous world, there is a concerted effort, both sides of the Atlantic, by nationalists and populists, to destroy multilateralism. And I think that, frankly, is dangerous. It will inevitably end in tears. And I feel sorry for young people who overwhelmingly want to be part of something supranational, global governance, working together, building things together, that they are being denied their future dreams by Brexit. So, I can see absolutely nothing positive about Brexit, frankly.
In your opinion, do you think Article 50 can be revoked? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, if you look at the wording of the treaty, it's an intent to leave, and I believe that obviously this is slightly moot legally. There are different legal opinions. I believe the British government could literally withdraw it unilaterally. There are those who say this would require the consent of the 27. Again, I don't really see that as being too problematic, because if Britain decided to drop Article 50, all the indications are, by comments by a number of EU 27 ministers and governments, that would be great. That they would be very happy to hear that. So whether it's legally necessary for the permission of the others or not, it's academics. I can't see them refusing it. Why on earth would they want us to leave? I mean, they are pretty fed up with us. Perfidious Albion. It doesn't mean they'd actually want us to leave actively if there were that legal possibility. I'm absolutely convinced that if the British government wants to stop Article 50 or suspend it or extend it or whatever, that can be done at their own political will, whenever they want, basically.
What do you make of Theresa May's Chequers deal agreement? Do you think it's workable?
Well, I gave it a kind of very cautious initial welcome when it was first announced, because it's a kind of softish, hard Brexit, still hard Brexit. It still ticks all her Lancaster House type red lines. No ECJ, no freedom of movement, no customs union, no single market, no contributions to the budget. So it's a kind of perfect scenario from the British government's point of view. And it of course solves the issue of the Northern Irish border, keeping that open in the Good Friday Agreement. But I don't think it's going to fly, personally. And it's been made very clear early on by Michel Barnier that it would, require an enormous amount of bureaucracy, enormous amount of trust in Britain to collect the tariffs, when in fact the track record of HMRC isn't very good. There was a whole, I think, €1 billion of uncollected tariffs on Chinese imports, which Olaf had been investigating. And also it would be very hard to police, because if you have a system whereby a rogue British trader imports things from a third country which Britain has a free trade agreement with, claims back the tariff difference from the EU one which will be applied, so he effectively imports his goods, as it were, at a reduced tariff. What's to stop that person or that company shipping it on to the single market of the European Union, because there are no more borders or checks or controls? So everything has to be very carefully policed. That's why I can see why Barnier is not happy about it, and it would also become a model for other countries outside of the European Union. So I think it does, to a certain extent. The facilitated customs arrangement would be very, very difficult to implement in practice. And of course, on the other side of it, which is the idea of a kind of regulatory union, a common rule book on just goods but not services, again, that fragments the single market, because many things now involve servicing the goods that you've exported, be that a contract for computer maintenance, be that a lorry which you've shipped and then you need to send a mechanic down to repair it, whatever. The idea of separating them isn't very clear, and how you would do that in practice. Of course, it's beneficial to the EU because they export more goods to us than we do to them, and we should be able to export more services where Britain would lose out. So the idea, it's the sweetener, the kick-in, is that Britain would be slightly disadvantaged. So overall it's well intentioned, and it's a kind of a compromise that Mrs. May's government's come up with to try and square all the circles. I don't think it's going to fly with the 27, personally. I'd hoped that it would be just an opening position in the negotiations, and that we would move from that to making more concessions, particularly over the customs union, to end up with what I call the Jersey model, which would be a genuine compromise and a working solution. But of course, David Lidington has said publicly it's the final deal, final offer, take it or leave it. If you don't take it, it's a no deal. And whether that's just bluff, I don't know. But certainly I've heard that, some of the harder line Brexiteers have sought reassurances from the Prime Minister that that is the final deal, and that's nothing, and she won't go 1 centimetre further than that, and she has reassured them that is the final deal. So we'll wait and see how it progresses. Of course, you hear from Dominic Raab and you hear from the Barnier that they are close to a deal. Well, I don't know how they're going to be close to a deal. Certainly it can't be on the basis of checkers, and there is still the big issue of the Irish border and the backstop.
Is Brexit just a preamble to Britain selling off its National Health Service to America and the UK slashing its food and environmental standards so that we can import, say, chlorinated chicken or burnt goat's head from Australia or something? Does that worry you?
Of course it worries me, and I'm a strong environmentalist, and indeed I hear perfectly loudly and clearly what people like Jacob Rees-Mogg from the ERG faction within my party, who are hardline. They want a kind of deregulated, libertarian, kind of what I would call Singapore-on-Thames model for the British economy. That's something I reject. And of course they talk about a cheap food policy, cheap footwear and clothes. That really means slashing tariffs, and you can't just do it selectively under the WTO most favoured nation rules. It have to be for everybody. That would flood the country with cheap imports, cheap food. Clearly they would have to have far less consideration to environmental and even labour standards and animal welfare standards, which are important to me. So I think that is the thinking in the Legatum Institute kind of hard right, hard extremist wing of my party and UKIP. I find that deeply concerning, and I don't think it's the view of other levers. Some of the more moderate ones would say, no, we would maintain the same environmental standards. But if the economy is under enormous pressure and Britain has to stay competitive, I can see why, if Brexit happens, a hard Brexit happens, and Britain has to be this global Britain free trading with the world, which is their other dream, particularly with the English-speaking world, the Anglosphere, etc., and they're up against a protectionist America under Trump, they may well have to slash all our standards and privatise the NHS. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly something that I would not support, but of course I won't be in politics, so it won't be my decision.
Finally, the Good Friday Agreement is a peace treaty that is registered with the UN. Would Brexit, by default, mean that the UK is breaking an international treaty, and if so, what are the implications?
Well, it's certainly the Good Friday Agreement was lodged as a treaty and it's binding, but of course it's very hard to make a case that Brexit, that actually it forbids either party from leaving the European Union. It's clearly not written into that. And I've just done a paper on Northern Ireland, the Irish border. But clearly the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement is a presumption that both countries will stay in the European Union. And certainly what is written in is the whole issue of the European Convention of Human Rights. And of course the whole spirit is to have cross-border cooperation on everything from health to policing to single market and electricity, etc. I've been very critical of the DUP and their very hardline stance. I believe personally that the only solution, if Britain must leave the European Union, United Kingdom must leave, that there should be a separate economic arrangement for Northern Ireland to stay in the single market and the customs union. If DUP would come to their senses, they'd realise that would be the best way of preserving the union within the United Kingdom, to allow for some checks in the Irish Sea, east-west, and have a separate economic status for Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland would become a magnet for investment and become a prosperous area rather than the laggard on the island of Ireland. But sadly, none of that is to be. Nobody could have foreseen the kind of perfect storm for hard Brexit, whereby the only voice in the UK Parliament is the DUP, who are ultra-sectarian, ultra-unionist, that they are hard Brexiteers, that they were against the Good Friday Agreement, if you remember back, to 2008. 1998, sorry. And so, we are in this perfect storm. There's no representation for any of the other communities within Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin have their abstention policy, and the DUP have this kind of confidence and supply deal with the British government, which of course means that the British government is dependent on their votes to stay in government. So it's a kind of perfect storm for hard Brexit and real problems at that border. And I'm lucky. I'm a dual national. I have an Irish citizenship as well as being British. So I have a lot of sympathy for the way Dublin has stood up for its rights. And I said this all along during the campaign. I'm particularly angry. I warned about the Irish border issue during the campaign and was rubbished by people like the Secretary of State, Theresa Villiers, and the DUP at the time, who said they had nothing to do with it. This was a complete red herring. It was a bilateral matter between Dublin and London. I predicted this would be a huge problem, and I also warned that if there is a hard border, which effectively, as you say, undermines the spirit of the Good Friday, there's a real danger of a return to smuggling, organised crime, and the Troubles, as we knew them, or I knew them in my generation, 30 years ago. So it's a very dangerous situation. In fairness, the British government recognises that and has made this undertaking in the joint report in December last year to have the backstop, to keep the border open under all circumstances. How they square that circle, given the fact that they have so many red lines that they're up against, I don't know. I haven't got the answer. And I'm hoping that somehow a white rabbit will be pulled out of the hat and they can explain it all to us. Chequers would have ticked that box, but Chequers has been rejected by the EU27, so I don't know how they're going to do this. Dominic Raab made a very strange statement, I think, whereby if the backstop has to be invoked, it would just be a temporary one. So I tweeted immediately, does that mean what? You'd basically keep the border open and then you'd reclose it or something? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, if there's a backstop, it has to be permanent. You can't have a temporary backstop. That's no reassurance whatsoever to Dublin. And of course, Dublin effectively, politically, has a veto on the withdrawal agreement unless something satisfactory is produced, and time is running out. October, November, we only have 3 or 4 months to go now.